You Jennifer, you talked a lot about, telling the stories, asking the right questions. And then this next question that Robin asks kind of lends itself to the question I was about to ask. What should nonprofits, like everyone on this call, be thinking about when researching and applying for grant funding? Certain metrics that they should think about, data?
Well, so the most important thing that you should do when researching and applying for funding is to search for grants that fit your organization, and ensure that you match the grant requirements. So when you find a funding announcement, you really want to review the requirements for the grant and ensure that you understand exactly what they're looking for. Once you understand that, don't try to fit a square peg in a round hole. Doesn't mean you can't be a little bit creative, particularly for RFPs that are a bit vague in what they're looking for and what the grant requirements are. But if an RFP specifically states that they are only funding programs that do X, then don't try to do Y. Some funding announcements are very specific and they know exactly what they want, and others are a bit more vague and are open to to interpretation and to different ideas and creativity, and others are not. And if you try too hard to jam your square peg in their round hole, it's likely that you won't be funded, and then you've wasted your kind of precious resources on spending the time to submit an application. Another thing is to know where to look for grants. So beyond basic internet sleuthing, you can search for grants. There's a bunch of different ways you can search for grants, a few different online sources. Grants.gov is one of them. There's the catalog of federal domestic assistance. There's also other more local sources on grant opportunities, including the board members of your nonprofit organization, local grant makers organizations, and regional foundation directories. So it's really important to know where to look and how to look.
Are there best practices when writing a grant? I mean, is that such a thing?
Yeah, that is absolutely a thing, and I have a lot to say about that. So the most important piece of advice here is to channel your inner first grader. And what I mean by that is follow directions. Nearly all government RFPs and many foundation RFPs as well have very specific instructions about things like page limits, headings, the order of things in the grant, and many other details. So if they tell you to use 12-point Times New Roman font, then use 12-point Times New Roman font. And some of the RFPs will actually state in there that if you don't follow their directions, that they won't even review your application. So follow the directions.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Because I just got some feedback from a grant that we got turned down from. And part of that feedback was you didn't answer no to a question.
Oh.
So even though it wasn't applicable, like you should have just checked no, because therefore you didn't check that box. That's why we couldn't continue with your application.
Oh,
so I just want to say, I want to reiterate what you just said about how important it is to be that first grader.
Yeah, it is very important. So the next thing is to make it as easy as possible for the funder to understand what you're proposing. So don't make the reviewers have to work to understand what you plan to do with the money. Be clear and don't leave them guessing. So a few specific ways that you can do that is to make use of headings in your proposal to guide the reader, to use headings that are descriptive and say, okay, in this next section, we're going to cover this, and have it be very clear that way, as opposed to just, several paragraphs that kind of jump all over the place. I always try to use tables as much as possible rather than text. Tables will always illustrate things like processes, timelines, goals, objectives, and other ideas much better than text will. Don't overdo the background information. Your proposal should not read like a college paper. You don't want to have 5 pages of background lit review and a thorough examination of the problem, and 2 pages talking about what you're going to do to address that problem. That being said, you do need to have some background information, and you do need to cite your sources. So don't ever just throw statistics out there or anything like that without citing your sources. And be sure that they're reputable sources. You don't want to use some kind of industry specific or anything that might be biased. So make sure that you use reputable, unbiased sources when you're citing statistics. It's okay to, I think it's okay to just include a link as your source in a footnote. So you don't need to have an exact APA bibliographical citation. I will just include a link because people are going to be reading your applications most likely online. If they do print it, they can always go back and click on the link if they want. The last thing that's really important, I think, is to tailor your application for each grant that you're applying for. So don't try to reuse old applications. Certainly you can take bits and pieces from previous applications, but they will likely need to be tailored to the application. I see it a lot like writing a resume. When I'm applying for a job, it's best to look at the job description and tailor your resume to the job description. So what kind of skills and duties are mentioned in the job description, and then use that same language in your resume. So same idea in a grant application. You want to really tailor your response to what they're looking for and to kind of mirror the language that they use and that sort of thing.
Thanks. Have you seen any shifts in the field of grant writing fundraising since the onslaught of COVID and its aftermath?
Yeah, I haven't really observed many shifts that I think can be attributed specifically to COVID, other than kind of the remote nature of everything. But yeah, that's
are more grantors, I mean, aside from that, are they, from your experience, allowing more unrestricted funding? Have you seen that, or is it still pretty much same as
I
same
have
old,
not
same old?
seen that. No.
Yeah. What about the quote unquote summer reckoning of 2020? Are you seeing anything in terms of how that's been affecting grant making, to Ruby's interest in equity and social justice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like much of our society, I think that there's quite likely a great deal of institutional and structural racism that foundations are either unaware of or are resistant to address. I think we're starting to see some changes, but like most things in the world, this change is really slow. I think we're seeing that funders have been making efforts to address equity and social justice issues in the actual programs and the people served by those programs that they're funding, or the issues addressed by those programs. But where change is slow is in the grantees selected to address those issues or to serve those people. There might be a bit of white saviorism going on here. The entire application process is often quite burdensome, especially for small organizations with small budgets to apply. The application process can be very time consuming and require a level of expertise that maybe some small organizations don't have, and then therefore have to contract out to have that done, which is an added cost that they might not be able to absorb. And also with new organizations who haven't been through the process before. So the whole process kind of favors older, established, and likely less diverse organizations, which kind of perpetuates the inequities that we see. But change is happening. I recently saw an application from the grant-making arm of a large corporation, and it not only asked for the gender and race and ethnicity data of the individuals that the grantee intended to serve, but it also asked for those that demographic data about the grantee's staff and board. So they were looking for diverse organizations that were led by diverse staff and that sort of thing. So there is some movement. It's not completely stagnant. Government RFPs are starting to routinely ask whether any employees of the grantee or board members are current or former employees of that government body. So presumably this is to reduce favoritism. I'm sure that's one aspect of it. And favoritism is certainly a practice that furthers inequity, right? So it prevents newer and smaller organizations from participating in the whole process.
Is that what you're saying as maybe the future of grant making from your perspective? That more
Yeah,
openness in
yeah.
terms of
So
yeah.
yeah, so to be honest, I don't really know what the future of grant making is. As I said, we are starting to see change. But when talking about publicly funded grants, government is slow to change, right? This is not this is not new information. Government is very slow to change. So who knows what the future holds? I don't think I can comment on that. Foundations and corporations are also slow to change. Organizations, especially the larger the organization, the slower they are to change, right? I think we're seeing a lot of changes in society where these types of organizations are being forced to change, but I think there's a lot of kicking and screaming that goes along with that. So who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank pardon me. How have the multiple pandemics impacted your work?
I mean, aside from things being just more difficult to do on, all remotely, and it being, it can be more challenging to develop relationships and network and all that sort of thing. I haven't seen a lot of impact in terms of, at the very beginning of the pandemic, it seemed like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? Everything's going to come to a standstill and nothing's going to get done. And how am I going to earn a living and that sort of thing? And that seemed very short-lived, and everybody just kind of figured out how to do it a different way. And here we are doing it a different way. Yeah.
That's pretty accurate. Yeah, we've all had to be like, okay, I guess we're doing something different.
I mean, yeah, if you asked this question 2 years ago and you said, you're not going to go into an office for 18 months or more, and kids aren't going to go to school, somebody said that to you and told them they were insane. But yes, here we are.
Right. What do you think should be on the top of mind? And this will be the final question before we turn it over to the audience. Well, during the next year or years, as grant makers, foundations, fundraising, top of mind?
Yeah, so I think that you should think about, like, what can you do now to increase your chances of getting grants in the future? Mm-hmm. So grants are often released with very short time frames, or you might not hear about a grant. It's already been out for 4 weeks, and now you only have 2 weeks left before the deadline. And funders there is no leeway on deadlines for grants. I've never seen, any case where an extension, except in the beginning of COVID, when it was the end of March of 2020, and I had a few late nights up till midnight working on a proposal, and then 2 days later found out that the federal government was extending the deadline by 2 months, which was which was great and not great at the same time. But yes, grants often have very short time frames, and funders' deadlines are deadlines. So a lot of times, you don't have much time to work on them, or they might be released during a time when you just don't have the bandwidth to work on them. And you might have to pass things up because when in the time frame you're on vacation or you have a big project going on, right? So whatever you can do ahead of time to kind of prepare yourself for grants that you might be submitting in the future is, I think, something that you should really focus on. So a couple things that you can do to prepare ahead of time is to have everything that might be needed for a grant application ready now and update it regularly. So the biggest thing is having data about your organization, having that at the ready and up to date. And that's kind of something that I think people probably put on the back burner a lot, but it could be really helpful to you to just kind of like maybe once a month, like look at your data about your organization. Is this current? Are there things that, thinking about like Mentor Washington, you have, 150 or so grantees, and I'm sure you have a database somewhere of those grantees. Somewhere, yeah. And keeping information up to date, entering information about your programs or whatever on a regular basis instead of waiting until you need it and then scrambling because you don't have the time. So other things to have ready are like a summary of your organization, its history, its mission, summaries of your existing or former programs or efforts or whatever it is that your organization does. having job descriptions of all of your positions and resumes, current and up-to-date resumes for all of your staff. And that means having, usually when somebody applies for a job, their current job isn't going to be on that resume, on their resume, right? But once you hire them, people should update their resume and put their current job at your organization on the resume, because a lot of RFPs will ask for resumes of staff. And so having that ready and not one less thing that you have to do, and have that ready to go ahead of time is one way you can prepare. And finally, to have a plan, having a plan for who will write your proposal. Identifying staff that have an interest in it, have experience in it, people who are good writers, organized, detail oriented, all that sort of thing. And if you don't have staff that have the time or expertise or interest in doing that, then develop a relationship with a grant writer, so that if you need to engage a grant writer in a short time period, you'll be more likely, you're not looking for a grant writer, when you have 3 weeks left, right? You've already kind of have a relationship with somebody, you've had some conversations with that person, and you can call upon them and say, hey, I have this grant that I need your help with, and are you available, next week? Because often that's what happens. So those are some things to consider. And another thing is to consider whether you're adequately evaluating or collecting data about your organization and its programs. We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. So is there anything that you can do now to, in terms of collecting data about your programs and everything, so that you'll have it at the ready when you come upon an RFP that you want to apply for.
I love it. Thanks so much, Jennifer. There's a couple of questions I see in the chat.
Yeah.
Robin asks, what about money for hours versus money for projects? Are you talking about like indirect costs, Robin? How's that best approach?
Well, it's probably very specific to me because I am a one-person mentor program and I don't work full-time. So like I have a federal grant that covers part-time hours. And so I'm always trying, I just started to try to get other grants to increase the hours so that I can work. So like I put in for a grant for hours to recruit mentors and mentees. But it was, the questions on the grant were very specific, more program oriented. And I imagine within those you could ask for certain hours to fulfill that. But what if it's just for hours, period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just an issue of like finding the right funding source. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier is you either have to find something that is that like specifically about that, or a funding source that is open to various things and that is not very prescriptive in what exactly they're looking for. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thanks. Delphina asks a great question. Due to limitations of certain grants, they seem to be constantly applying for multiple funding streams to cover all bases. However, it gets complicated in terms of weaving it all together. Any suggestions?
No, that's a really good question. Yeah, and somebody commented below, or I think it was Delphina commented again, the foundation funding kind of answered your own question, is better that way. Yeah. Because again, a lot of, particularly government, publicly funded RFPs, grants are very prescriptive in what they're looking for. They put out grants for, we want organizations to do X, and that's what they're looking for. And yes, certainly foundations have much more latitude. And so, weaving together funding from different sources is much easier that way. It is quite difficult to do that with publicly funded grants because they, for whatever reason, we can theorize all day about what their reasons are, but they're looking for they know what they want ahead of time, typically. So yeah, I'm not sure if that really answered your question.
Delphina, do you have a follow-up
Yeah, I think that in answer to an extent, I mean, I feel like it's just like an artful thing right now. Like we just had a grant come across our desk with OSPI to kind of, and it gives us some leverage as far as like focusing on social emotional learning through mentoring programs and things like that. But then we have this, like most of our program is funded through this HCA grant. And but that is so tight and restrictive as far as what it's allowed to do. So I just get nervous as far as like piling on additional funding streams, but trying to keep programming like the structure simple, and keep the structure the same. Because I feel like sometimes what we end up doing is like tweaking little things to keep fitting these grants instead of just keeping the program the same.
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And again, both OSPI and HCA are going to be very specific about what they're looking for. And so, yeah, and that's unfortunately, that's just how it is for publicly funded grants. Yeah.
And that's less so for foundations.
Definitely less so for foundations. Yeah, foundation grants just definitely tend to be more open to creativity, and they're kind of just overall looking for, they want to address like a larger issue, but they're not saying how they want it addressed, or that sort of thing. So
yeah, and sometimes at foundations you could build relationships with one of the grants managers. And that's been helpful to like, hey, is this right? I've done that before with people that from foundations, like, hey, is this right? Should we be applying for this? And if I know them well enough, they'll guide me yes or no.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, and I think, what we found to be helpful is that the thing with foundation grants is they don't tend to be like, at least the ones I've encountered have not been like multi-year grants. It's like continually applying. So it's nice to have the basic bones of a state HCA grant that allows like for the program time, staff time, etc. And we use the foundation grants as like the glue to fill in all the spots, right? Like incentives and food and all the things that the other grants, for whatever reason.
Smart. That's a very smart approach.
Yeah. Elizabeth has a question. What is the value of those paid grant watch systems? If any.
I don't have a lot of experience with them, but they can hurt if you have the budget. They're not terribly expensive, I don't think. But I might be misrepresenting that, but I don't have a lot of experience with them, unfortunately. Typically people are coming to me. I actually don't do a lot of going out and looking for grants. I usually have people coming to me, people like you coming to me and asking to help write grants. So I don't have as much experience on that end.
Kind of feel like I get this regular email that says grants are available, and I'm hooked, and I go to find out, and I just have to pay this fee, and they'll tell me what they are. So I've never
I would be suspect of those as well, because I can't imagine. I'm trying to imagine who would be putting their grants on there. It certainly wouldn't be the government. I can say that for sure, that the government is not going to put their grants. I could be wrong about that, but I would be very shocked if the government paid any kind of money to put their grants out there. They have all of their own ways of getting information out about their grants. Foundations might, be more likely to do that. Again, I don't know what the fees are on their end. Maybe it doesn't actually cost them anything. Maybe it only costs the grantees, the applicants. I don't know.
I kind of got the sense that it might be an organization that does the background work to try to find grants, and then they make them available and to people who will pay. And so it's maybe one, but I don't know. Like I said, I haven't paid for it, so just wondered if anyone had.
Yeah. Has anyone on the call used like Grant Watch or Grant Station or any of the other? No. At my previous job, we've used a platform that, to be honest, did not prove very beneficial. Most of the work we did was through prospecting, and we hired someone else to do the prospecting. But like a general grants watch, you may see, or as an example, you may see 50 to 100 grants, and 2 are applicable to the work you're actually doing. But there's a lot of them, and not very, from my perspective, and this is just me, I haven't seen the value add in some of those platforms.
Unless I'm desperate, I will not put out anything for that.
Right.
We'll see. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And Mentor Washington will send out any grants notices that we see in our newsletter. So whenever that happens, we'll send some out, because OSPI has a couple grants, as Delphina just mentioned, coming out. We will send those out, of course. Thank you, Vic. Join the hub for updates on new grants. Any questions for Jennifer? Any other questions? Excellent. Well, I would love to, we're a small and mighty group. I would love to hear what's working well in your grant writing and what questions may still be lingering. And I would even broaden that to fundraising. What's working well and what questions are still lingering?
I could share a little bit of experience. I'm like somebody else who spoke, one man shop, part-time. Well, I have a lot of expenses other than my stipend. So it's all foundation grants. Or I connected with a grant writer who said, essentially, stop thinking about grant writing and thinking about funding as a kind of a multi-pronged project that you have to think about all the time. And so it includes an annual appeal, it includes a fundraiser, it includes individual donations and fostering those relationships. And then occasionally there's a grant. And I know this will come as a complete shock to people who are in the mentoring program, but I found that even in grant writing, relationships matter. And so I think I've written 7 grants, all small, all $10,000 or less, in the last 4 years, and received all of them. Some of them have said, well, we can't give you 10,000, we'll give you 3. Sorry, and it's great. But in every single case, I reached out to the person in charge, and we had coffee, and we talked, and we got to know each other, and it helped. In terms of grant writing as a standalone topic, I had a really great aha moment with my first grant that I thought, this will be a good exercise for me. I've handcuffed myself to my desk until this thing is done. And I have some confidence in my writing ability, but I've never written a grant. So I'm just going to do this and I'll learn. And I had this connection, as I mentioned before. And so I just wrote it from the heart, and I answered the questions, which is great advice, Jennifer. Follow the damn directions. And then I got the grant, and I was completely shocked. And then I asked later, like, can you tell me why I got the grant? And he couldn't and wouldn't. But he did say this: I was in the room when the decision was made, and I can tell you that temperature in your case mattered. And so, because I just wrote from my heart, some passion about our kids and our program came through, and that led to a yes of $10,000 for me. And so that really helped me. And I've deliberately not held back in terms of expressing my passion when I write a grant. And that's just been a good lesson for me that I just stumbled upon because I can't help myself. But it worked, and it continues to work. So that's all I got.
Thanks, Mike. I think you hit on two salient points. One, storytelling and your passion, and 2, asking for feedback. Oftentimes as a grantee that receives a no, and you said a yes, we don't ask for feedback. because we don't feel like we deserve it. And I may be speaking just as the former actor of my of my previous life, like, oh, I didn't get the part because I don't deserve it. When in fact, there's reasons why. And some can be so small as like you didn't check the box, and others could be like, oh, I didn't understand your story. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. Any other successes with fundraising or grant writing?
I think something that just as a tool that's like, I'm just kind of kicking off back into grant writing, but I think that something as a tool is like thinking about the direction that we want to go and like having kind of a running list of like, these are little chunks of projects that could be funded by smaller grants versus like the overall program. So we know we want to increase like social emotional learning through like some after school groups. And so that's like a tiny chunk to pull off that we can target. So I think that that's really helpful. I think the other thing, like I just have like this running frustration because like I feel like I don't mind collecting data in the least. Like quantitative is fine with me too. I prefer stories and qualitative, but I think the thing that's frustrating is like the data that we collect, the data that we collect for our HCA grant is like meaningless. Like if we were to transfer that into a grant, it would mean nothing. And so just figuring out what the quantitative data, like we'd be doing it entirely on our own, like it wouldn't, and figuring out like what we should be looking for. So we use a lot like a healthy youth survey because it does talk, like all of Washington does that, like that shows a bit of a chunk around like anxiety and depression and suicide ideation, etc. But it would be great to know more about like what other quantitative data we could be collecting that would help in grants.
Yeah, that's a really big question. I mean, it's going to depend a lot on what it is that you're doing. Yeah, I think it's hard for me to answer that question without knowing precisely what you're doing, but there's a lot, there's surveys, you can survey your participants. And so you could be able to say, provide some data about what their experiences are in the program or what kind of outcomes they had. If you're doing mentoring services, that would be one way. There's definitely qualitative information is helpful as well. There's also, if you're doing like an education intervention, you can look at data. This is just an example, but if there was some kind of education intervention, you could look at attendance data. Did attendance data increase? Or referrals, disciplinary referrals, were there changes in disciplinary referrals and stuff like that. So it really depends a lot on what it is that you're doing. But yeah, that's where your evaluation, having a good evaluation plan comes into play. And I should just say, thinking about your evaluation plan before you start implementing a program and not after, because often it's too late. If you've been implementing the program for 8 months, it's hard to go back. You can't go back in time and survey people or gather data after you've already been doing it. And I see that very often. I've seen times where organizations have gotten a grant and they're a 3-year grant or a 5-year grant, and they're a year into it, they enlist an evaluator to come up with an evaluation plan. It's like, well, I don't have a time machine and I can't go back in time and help you collect this data that you should have collected in the beginning. So it is really important to think about that stuff early or sooner rather than later.
Wondering if I could kind of, Delphina and Mike both brought up stuff like, I am a poet and I lean toward the qualitative data as well because, when I was educated as a school counselor, I always thought, how do you put in numbers? I saved this many lives, during a certain period of time. But when I was writing some grants, I felt like I was doing too much of the passion part that Mike was talking about, and maybe leaning too much on the the creative writing kind of feel. And so I didn't know if that was good because, hey, that brings that personality to that particular grant, as opposed to just shoving more numbers and data that people see all the time. So I felt like you sucked at that because you totally didn't do this and this and this. And I mean, I cut stuff too, but where's the line on that one?
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky dance. Mike's point is good. You do want to have some passion in there, but it also depends on who the funder is. So I keep kind of coming back to, publicly funded versus foundations, right? Foundations are going to have a lot more leeway in what they can do. Government is very, very prescriptive, right? So you don't want, and also most grant application, most RFPs that I see have page limits, right? So it's almost always a struggle for me to fit everything that I need to say into the page limit they have. So when you're thinking about a page limit and you have to balance your passion part with your hard cold facts, if you're going to run out of space and you can't adequately describe what your plan is and what you're proposing, you will have to forego some of the passion part. And I said earlier, like, you don't want to have 5 pages of background information. You don't want it to read like a college paper, but you do have to have a little bit of it. So, it's just always this dance that you're doing, this balance of those two things. But I can't stress enough the importance of adequately and clearly communicating the what and the how. So what are you proposing that you're going to do with the money, and how do you plan to do it? They don't want to see an application where you're like, oh, mentoring isn't important and we really should mentor kids. Okay, well, that's great. But like, how are you going to do that? How many are you going to, like, what is your plan? Where are you going to get mentors from? And like, where are you going to mentor the kids? How are you going to recruit the kids that you're going to mentor? All of that information is really important, and especially with a publicly funded application.
Thanks, Jennifer. As our time's wrapping up, I just want to say thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. This was a really informative conversation. Really appreciated your insight. Here reiterate what I heard as an important, like, how much, by when, for what, like having those 3 elements in your grant application and conversations with funders is key.
And the one thing I just wanted to touch upon, because we haven't talked about it at all, is the budget or the cost proposal, because most government grants and a lot of foundation grants as well want you to submit some kind of budget. And so, that's where, the devil is in the details on those, right? So they're going to, you talked about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And now you have to demonstrate that you actually can do it within the amount of money that they're giving you. So you can't propose that you're going to do all these grand, wonderful things if they're only going to give you, $25,000 or whatever. So, the budget is, you want to, do a good job on the budget and make sure that it's accurate and that it is feasible, right? It needs to be feasible. So that's the most important thing, I think, with the budget.
Awesome. Jennifer, how do people get in contact with you?
I'll put my email in the box here, and my website you can check out as well. Well, my website is just in the email. So if you want to look at that, it's in the email. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciated this. As always, so good to see your faces. We're all in this together, as they say. If you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. Let's go far. So appreciate everyone here. Let's keep it moving. Have a happy pre-Halloween weekend leading up to Halloween weekend.
And James, it's 12:30 now.
It's 12:30 now. Thank you.
12:30 now.
Yeah, that's that. Thank you. I'm getting my times mixed up. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a great one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.